We are so glad you are tuning in to an LOPC sermon. This message is an excerpt from one of our worship services, which contains other elements such as songs and prayer. We hope that you hear a word from God today.
So I'm wondering today if you have ever had an encounter with another person that totally changed the course of your life. For me, that person was Mr. Heald. You see, in high school, I took biology my freshman year and absolutely hated it. Hated it. The counselor that I saw end of my junior year told me that in order for me to get into college to do what I wanted to do at the time, which was to study special education and work with autistic children, I was going to need 2 years of high school science, and I had only had one. Now, there were two chemistry teachers in my high school, one who taught that dreaded biology class, and the other was Mr. Heald. And fortunately, I was placed in Mr. Heald's class, and he made me fall in love with chemistry. There was something about the beauty and the order of things that actually made my heart sing. Imagining electrons orbiting in specific energy fields around protons and neutrons, and understanding that that was the basis of everything that we can touch and breathe and taste and see. He taught me to love chemistry. And in a major pivot, I ended up majoring in chemical engineering, which I can tell you required a heck of a lot more science, like physics and quantum mechanics. But I can also tell you that were it not for Mr. Heald, I would have not moved to California to take my first job. I would have not met my husband, David, would not have raised my family here, and would not be here standing in front of you today. Mr. Heald changed the entire path of my life because of my encounter with him. The Christmas story we're going to be looking at today is about scientists of a different kind. They did not observe the orbits of subatomic particles, but they did observe the movement of the celestial bodies in the night sky and probed them for meaning. Like good scientists, they formulated hypotheses based on what they observed and then set out to test them. That led them to have an encounter which set their lives on a completely different path. So settle in and listen now as I read our passage for this morning, which is from Matthew chapter 2. In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem asking, "Where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? For we have observed his star in the east and have come to pay him homage." When King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all Jerusalem with him. And calling together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it has been written by the prophet, 'And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel.'" Then Herod secretly called for the Magi and learned from them the exact time when the star had appeared. Then he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word, so that I may also go and pay him homage." When they had heard the king, they set out, and there ahead of them went the star that they had seen in the east until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw that the star had stopped, they were overwhelmed with joy. On entering the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they knelt down and paid him homage. Then opening their treasure chests, they offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they left for their own country by another road. Now, I got a little giddy when Peter asked me to preach this Sunday because it was going to give me an opportunity to share with you one of my favorite paintings, and it is this. So as you look at this painting, I wonder what you observe. Now, you may be saying, Jane, I'm not giddy at all. This just looks like a really complicated, crowded, boring, old-timey painting. And it does look that. But when I saw it for the first time in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, I was stopped dead in my tracks. Because you see, I think the person that's in the center of this painting is a woman. She's dressed differently than everyone else, high bodice on her gown, dressed in pink, delicate features, fair complexion, slender hands, and it appears as if Mary is looking straight at her. For the first time in my life, I actually saw someone like myself in this story of the Magi's adoration of the baby Jesus. Now, I say this, but I'm also aware that we really don't know much about the Magi at all. We don't know how many there were. Tradition says there's 3, because they brought 3 gifts to Jesus. The Gospel of Matthew never calls them kings. And it wasn't until the 8th century when they were actually given names and places of origin. You may have heard that one of them is called Balthazar, king of Arabia or Ethiopia, Melchior, king of Persia, and Gaspar, king of India. But it's interesting that most of what we know about the Magi is nowhere to be found in the Bible. What we do know, however, is that they were most likely priests or scholars who were known for their knowledge and wisdom of astrology or astronomy. And they had been observing the night sky, and one star in particular stuck out to them. Now, the Magi were not Jewish. From the perspective of the nation of Israel, they were outsiders and foreigners. So it's actually quite striking that they took upon a long, arduous journey to travel to Bethlehem to find this child that had been told to them was going to be king of the Jews based on their observation of the stars. That's really all we know about them. We know a lot more about King Herod, who was the ruler of Judea when Jesus was born. He was a puppet king, subservient to the Roman Empire. And he was the kind of guy that played whichever side of the political aisle was to his advantage. And he did whatever was needed to maintain order in Israel. He was a big infrastructure guy. And he used slave labor to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem to a much greater splendor than had ever been seen in King Solomon's day. But still, the Jews never accepted him as their true king. He was also a cruel tyrant, and he was wary of anyone who would challenge his reign. He grew suspicious of anyone he thought was conspiring against him and had them executed. And that included 2 wives, 3 sons, and his mother-in-law. So we can understand why he was not completely loved as king of Judea. Now, the appearance of the Magi actually put Herod on edge because here was someone predicted to be king of the Jews who could be a threat to his rule. So he called the scribes and the Pharisees together to gather more intel, and these are the same people who would later condemn Jesus to death. And he summoned the Magi and then sent them on what we can infer was perhaps a covert operation. When the Magi saw that the star had stopped, we are told that they were overwhelmed with joy. And a seminary friend of mine recently pointed out to me that in the original Greek New Testament, it says they were joyful with exceedingly great joy. Now that's a lot of joy. And we might assume that it was because their hypothesis about this child who had been born in Bethlehem was confirmed. But this word that is used for joy is a word in the New Testament Greek that is not used to describe temporal or superficial happiness over material pursuits. It's joy that is used to describe what happens when we realize that God's promise and potential and power and presence is all right there in front of us. And we stay rooted in that reality. It's the type of joy that comes from an encounter with Jesus, which gives us hope for salvation. That's the type of joy they experienced. Now, after visiting Jesus, they had a choice to make. They could return to Herod and tell him that a new king of the Jews had been born. Or they could listen to the dream they had had and return home by another way. They opted to defy Herod's orders, and so they did return home by another way. And I think that was both literally and metaphorically true for them. Herod was infuriated. And as a result, he ordered that every child under the age of 2 living in or around Bethlehem be killed, because he wanted to snuff out any challenge to his reign. We later learn that Joseph is warned in a dream to escape to Egypt, and he takes Mary and Jesus there, so they are safe. Now, tomorrow is Epiphany. It's the day when we, by tradition, say that the Magi presented their gifts to the baby Jesus. And according to the Oxford English Dictionary, an epiphany is a manifestation of a divine or supernatural being. It's a moment of sudden revelation or insight. I think it's fair to say that the Magi experienced an epiphany. They were first-hand witnesses of the right here, right now appearance of God in flesh and blood. They were face to face with the embodiment of God's love and grace. They couldn't go home the same way they had come because they were not the same people. When an epiphany is God's revelation of God's own self to us, how can we not be changed and set out on a different path for our lives? And isn't that the entire thread that runs through the Christmas story? All the way from John the Baptist in the desert, who's crying out for people to repent, which literally means to turn and follow a new way. After Mary visited Elizabeth, she sang a song about a new topsy-turvy world in which the proud and the powerful and the rich would be brought low, and the lowly would be lifted up, and the hungry would be filled with good things. And the Magi encountered Jesus. They worshiped a king whose power and authority and leadership would be the antithesis of Herod's. And they too found a new way home. Now, my daughter gave me this card for Christmas. She didn't know at the time that I was going to be preaching on the Magi. So it was perfect for me. And I actually take this question, are we nearly there yet, as a double entendre. You see, we could hear the Magi asking each other that question as they're on the long journey to Bethlehem. But we could also hear them asking it of themselves on the journey home, because they had the same distance to travel to get back home. We could also hear this question asked of us. Are we nearly there yet? And to answer that question, we actually need to know where we are headed. Do we dare let our encounter with the Christ child this Christmas season change us and change the course of our lives? Can we see ourselves somehow in this story? You see, we may not follow a star like the Magi did, but we can let the Magi point the way towards some possible steps we could take, some paths we could consider as we enter this new year. First, like the eyes of science, the eyes of faith are observant. They pay attention to what is seen and what is unseen. So will we seek signs of where and how God is showing up in our lives and in the lives of the people around us and in our world? If we do, we might just have our own epiphanies and be joyful with exceedingly great joy. Or will we be attentive to where God might be leading us? And will we venture out confident in God's direction for our lives? Will we bear witness to the love of God, which we've seen knows no cultural or geographic boundaries, because God's love wants to draw all of us close? And will we share that love with others? And perhaps most especially with those who are not like us, who we might consider to be outsiders or foreigners. Will we be generous in our gifts and what we give to God, and use those to serve other people? Will we refuse to participate in power structures that are abusive or coercive, unjust or violent? Will we instead seek to do justice with compassion for those who are poor and vulnerable among us? As we celebrate Jimmy Carter's life this week, I'm reminded that Jimmy Carter said that his faith taught him that power was to be used to help make the lives of other people better, not ourselves. And finally, will we trust in God's dreams for us and step out in a new direction with courage and perseverance? So it's a good question for us to ask today. Are we nearly there? God's work in us and in our world takes time to come to fruition, just like the Magi's long study of the night sky and their long journey to Bethlehem and back home. But each step we take can get us closer to being nearly there, if we allow Christ, the light of the world, to guide our path. Amen.
We invite you to get to know our community better. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel, explore our website, or perhaps visit us here on a Sunday morning for worship. We look forward to getting to know you and know that you always have a place here at LOPC.